The envelope appeared on the dinner table just as everyone was passing plates around. It was not a figure of speech. My father literally placed it beside the bowl of sweet potatoes and the basket of rolls, then leaned back in his chair as if he had completed some important family tradition. The room fell quiet as I glanced down at the document. Across the top were words that immediately caught my attention. It was a demand for me to leave my own home. My mother was the first to speak. She wore the same calm expression she always used when delivering bad news. She never raised her voice or made a scene. Instead, she spoke softly enough to make harsh decisions sound reasonable. "You have 1 week," she said. "Luke needs the house." My brother sat across from me without a trace of discomfort. If anything, he looked hopeful. That stung more than anger ever could. For a moment, I simply stared at the paperwork. 6 years earlier, my grandfather Owen had made a decision that changed everything. Before he passed away, he legally transferred ownership of his Asheville home directly to me. He had completed every document properly and made sure the transfer was recorded well in advance. The reason was never a mystery. When his health began failing, I was the one driving him to appointments. I handled repairs when something broke. I paid contractors when work needed to be done. While other people found excuses, I spent weekends helping him maintain the place he loved. Luke had a very different relationship with responsibility. He was always borrowing money, always recovering from another setback, always promising that better days were just around the corner. My parents never liked Grandpa's decision. They claimed it was unfair. They argued he had acted emotionally. They insisted he had judged Luke too harshly during a difficult period. What they really meant was much simpler. The son they favored did not receive the house, and they never accepted that outcome. The conflict between Luke and me went back years. Growing up, he created one problem after another and somehow managed to avoid consequences. Whenever something went wrong, there was always an explanation waiting for him. He was having a hard time. He was under pressure. He did not mean it. The excuses changed, but the pattern never did. Now Luke was 32 years old and struggling financially once again. Yet there he sat at my table, while our parents acted as though my home was a resource that should automatically be handed over to him. My mother folded her napkin neatly and looked at me. "You have enjoyed this place for years, Mara," she said. "Luke deserves a chance to get back on his feet." I finally raised my eyes from the document. "And what exactly gives you the right to demand that?" I asked. My father tapped the papers with confidence. "This is a formal legal notice," he said. "You can cooperate now, or spend a lot of money fighting later." I examined the document more carefully. The longer I read, the less impressive it became. It was not issued by a court. It carried no judicial authority. Instead, it was a letter written to sound intimidating, packed with complicated language and vague legal references designed to pressure someone who did not know better. It looked official at first glance, but underneath the polished wording, there was very little substance. Luke crossed his arms. "You do not need a whole house to yourself," he said. "I have responsibilities." A short laugh escaped before I could stop it. The idea was almost unbelievable. That home had never been a gift that required no effort. Every year I paid the property taxes. I invested my own money restoring worn rooms. I dealt with permit issues, contractors, inspections, and repairs. When the heating system failed, I worked extra shifts for months to afford a replacement before winter arrived. The house stood exactly as it did because I had spent years protecting it. And now the same people who ignored all of that were sitting across from me, acting as though they could simply decide it belonged to someone else. My parents had never invested time, effort, or money into that house. Yet the moment property values in the neighborhood began rising and the place became worth a small fortune, they suddenly discovered a deep concern for what they called fairness. My mother mistook my silence for agreement. "Your grandfather was emotional when he transferred the house to you," she said. "Everyone knows that. Everyone." There it was again. The familiar family verdict that somehow never required my participation. My father lifted his glass and spoke with practiced confidence. The attorney believes Luke may have a legitimate argument. Owen wanted the property to remain within the family. I looked directly at him. I am family, I said. Luke let out a short laugh. You know exactly what he means. And I did. He did not mean family. He meant son. He meant the child my parents always protected, defended, and prioritized. He meant the person who never seemed to face the same rules as everyone else. I placed the notice back on the table. You chose Thanksgiving dinner to do this. Dad shrugged. I thought handling it face-to-face was the mature approach. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the doorbell interrupted us. Nobody moved. A moment later, it rang again. I stood, crossed the hallway, and opened the front door. On the porch stood Priya, my closest friend and the neighbor who lived next door. In one hand, she carried a pie. In the other was a sealed envelope. Priya worked for a respected estate law firm downtown. More importantly, she was one of the few people who knew my father had been making inquiries about the property behind my back. 3 days earlier, I had told her that if my parents tried something during Thanksgiving, I wanted to know exactly what I was dealing with. The second she saw my expression, she understood. So they went through with it, she said quietly. I nodded. Together, we returned to the dining room. My father immediately sat straighter. Who is this? My neighbor, I replied, and a witness. Priya placed the pie on the counter and stepped toward the table. Then she held out the sealed envelope. This arrived at our office today from Mr. Bennett, she said. Certified delivery. My supervisor thought he might want to see it immediately if he decided to present that notice tonight. My father accepted the envelope with visible irritation. What is this supposed to be? Priya remained calm. Open it. He did. I watched his eyes scan the first page, then stop. Within seconds, the confidence disappeared from his face. My mother noticed it too. Dad looked at me, then back at the document. For the first time that evening, he looked uncertain. Luke leaned closer. What does it say? My father stayed silent. Priya answered for him. It contains a copy of your father's sworn probate declaration, the one where he acknowledged Mara as the sole legal owner of the property and agreed that any relative challenging her ownership rights would lose access to the remaining trust assets. My father reread the page. That is not what it means. The response sounded weak even to him. My mother's attention shifted toward him immediately. Priya carefully kept the rest of the packet in her possession and pointed to the document beneath the dining room light. It means exactly what it says, she replied. I remained standing at the head of the table. To keep myself composed, I picked up a fork and turned it slowly between my fingers. Across from me, Luke was practically hanging over his chair trying to read the page. My mother had gone completely still. I recognized that expression. It appeared whenever she realized a situation was slipping beyond her control and she had to decide whether to retreat or push harder. She chose to push. Legal paperwork does not determine what is fair, she said. Priya met her gaze. Fortunately, this is not a question of fairness. Then she indicated a section farther down the page. I knew those words. Years earlier, after my grandfather's funeral, his attorney had explained the arrangement to me in detail. The house was only part of the estate plan. Grandpa had transferred ownership of the property directly to me, but he had also established a separate investment trust intended for my parents and Luke. It was not an enormous amount of money, but it was substantial enough that they cared deeply about it. The trust held roughly $240,000, distributed over time under specific conditions. One of those conditions required every beneficiary to sign a family settlement agreement and formally acknowledge that they would not challenge the ownership transfer or create disputes regarding the estate. At the time, everyone had signed without hesitation. Now, sitting around my dining room table years later, they appeared to have forgotten exactly what they had agreed to. The arrangement had always been straightforward. The house belonged to me. The trust belonged to them. My grandfather had separated those two things with remarkable precision. If anyone attempted to dispute ownership of the property, interfere with my right to live there, or help another person advance a claim against the house, they risked losing their share of the trust entirely. He had anticipated this situation long before it happened, and despite that, my father had signed every document. Now the evidence was sitting directly in front of him. Luke finally grabbed the papers from Dad's hands. "Let me see that." His eyes moved quickly across the page. Then he slowed down and read it again. "What is this supposed to mean?" Before Priya could answer, I spoke. "It means Grandpa made sure nobody could pressure me into giving up the house after he was gone." My mother's expression tightened. That was never his intention. Priya folded her arms. "The documents say otherwise." "No," my mother replied. "Lawyers twisted his wishes into something he never wanted." Dad finally regained some confidence. "This is just probate paperwork. It does not prevent us from discussing a family occupancy interest." The phrase sounded impressive until anyone actually thought about it. Priya remained completely unfazed. "Then perhaps you should continue reading before making that argument." She handed the next page directly to Luke. That was deliberate. My brother trusted documents more when he read them himself. His eyes moved down the page, and without realizing it, he began reading aloud. "Any beneficiary who directly or indirectly challenges ownership, possession, or lawful control of the Asheville residence transferred to Mara Bennett, or assists another party in doing so, shall forfeit eligibility for further trust distributions." The dining room fell silent. No one needed a legal education to understand that sentence. The meaning was painfully clear. Challenge the house, lose the money. My father rose so quickly that his chair scraped loudly across the hardwood floor. This was never meant to be used this way. I could not help laughing. "Against you, you mean?" My mother immediately stepped in. "Your grandfather was influenced." "No," I said. "He was paying attention." That was the truth. During the final years of his life, Grandpa noticed everything. He saw Luke borrow equipment and return it damaged. He heard conversations where my father hinted that the property would be better managed by someone else. He watched my mother dismiss every effort I made as temporary or self-serving. He rarely argued. Instead, he observed. He listened. And when no one was paying attention, he met quietly with attorneys and financial advisors. By the time anyone realized what he had done, every document was already complete. Luke dropped the paper onto the table. "So, because I struggled for a few years, he decided I should never get a chance." That was enough. I set my fork down and met his eyes. "You are not being denied a chance," I said. "You have a job. You are healthy. You are an adult. What you are upset about is that you cannot take something that belongs to somebody else." His face darkened. "This is exactly why Grandpa should not have left the house to you. You think you are better than everyone." I shook my head. "No. I think I am the person who paid the taxes, the repairs, the insurance, the furnace replacement, the roof maintenance. I am the person who stayed when everyone else walked away." My mother stood as well, though far more slowly. "You are being unnecessarily harsh." The word almost made me laugh again. Harsh. As if presenting me with an eviction demand during Thanksgiving dinner had somehow been an act of kindness. Without saying anything, Priya reached into the folder and removed another document. "This is the page your husband really needs to read." She placed it directly in front of my father. It was a formal notice from the trust administrator. The document had not yet been filed, but it was prepared and ready. The language was clear. If my father continued pursuing claims against the property, encouraged Luke to assert ownership rights, or failed to withdraw his demands within 72 hours, the administrator could suspend future trust payments and begin enforcement proceedings under the forfeiture provisions. The color drained from Dad's face. Not guilt, not embarrassment. Fear. Financial fear. For the first time all evening, he looked genuinely worried. Luke noticed immediately. "How much money are we talking about?" Nobody answered. The silence told him everything. His head snapped toward Dad. "You told me this was straightforward," Dad fired back. "It was supposed to be." I looked at him. "Meaning you assumed I would not understand the difference between an actual legal order and a letter designed to scare me?" My mother jumped in quickly. "We were trying to handle this privately." "No," I replied. "You were hoping I would surrender before anyone examined the paperwork closely." Priya calmly folded her hands. "Now that everyone has reviewed the documents, I recommend withdrawing the notice, abandoning any claim to the property, and moving on." Luke was still staring at my father. "What happens if she reports this?" "Potentially," Priya said. "All remaining trust distributions could be lost." My brother immediately turned his frustration toward Dad, not toward me, not toward the house, toward the person who had convinced him the plan would work. At that moment, I understood something important about my grandfather. He never expected shame to stop them. He never expected lectures or moral arguments to change them. So he created consequences they would understand immediately. Consequences tied to money. Dad snatched the eviction notice from the table as though removing the paper might somehow erase the evening. But it was far too late for that. Then another knock echoed through the house. 3 measured knocks. Professional. Deliberate. Everyone looked toward the hallway. At the same moment, my phone vibrated. A message appeared on the screen. "This is Caleb Mercer with Harlan and Rowe. I am outside. Please ask your father to remain available for a brief conversation." A few moments later, Caleb stepped through the front door. He wore a dark overcoat and carried himself with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. His eyes swept across the room. The unfinished Thanksgiving meal. The legal papers spread across the table. The notice clutched in my father's hand. The tension hanging in the air. After taking it all in, he gave a small nod. "I do not believe anyone needs to explain what has been happening here tonight." "I can already tell what has been happening here." Caleb's voice was calm, but it carried enough authority to stop the room from moving. My father made one last attempt to regain control. "This is a family matter." Caleb placed a leather folder on the dining table and looked directly at him. It stopped being only a family matter when legal threats were used against the owner of a property in contradiction to documents that had already been signed and acknowledged. The response ended the argument before it could begin. Priya stepped aside while Caleb organized several sets of papers. He remained standing. My father did the same. The rest of us stayed frozen around the table, surrounded by half-finished Thanksgiving dishes and legal documents. The contrast would have been almost absurd if it were not happening in my own home. Caleb focused on my father. "Did you present a demand requiring Mara to leave the property tonight?" Dad straightened his shoulders. "I delivered a formal letter." Caleb nodded once. "That answers the question." He removed 3 separate packets from his folder and placed them on the table. One in front of my father, one in front of my mother, one in front of Luke. "These are official notices from the Trust Administration Office," he said. "Effective immediately, all pending trust distributions are suspended while a potential violation of the trust agreement is reviewed." Luke reached for his packet immediately. "Wait, everybody loses payments." "Yes," Caleb replied, "because of her." Luke pointed toward me. "No," Caleb said, "because of the terms your grandfather established." That answer hit harder than any lecture could have. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Caleb pulled out another document and slid it toward the center of the table. This is the reason action was taken tonight. At the top was an email exchange from 2 days earlier. The sender was my father. The subject line referred to a proposed transition arrangement regarding the house. Attached to the email was a document claiming that I had agreed to leave the Asheville property before the end of the year and allow Luke to move in. In exchange, the document referenced family cooperation and mutual understanding. I stared at it. The signature at the bottom was supposed to be mine. It was not. Anyone who knew my handwriting would have recognized that immediately. My mother's face lost all color. Luke looked confused. The order of those reactions told me more than either of them ever could. Either Mom had no idea the document existed, or she had assumed no one would examine it carefully. Caleb tapped the page lightly. The signature issue was identified almost immediately. The trust office maintains signature records from the estate settlement process. Comparison was straightforward. Dad opened his mouth as if searching for an explanation. Finally, he said it was only a draft proposal. Between who? I asked. You and your imagination. Luke turned toward him. You told me she was already considering it. Dad's expression hardened. I said she might be open to discussion. Caleb calmly shook his head. The email states something different. It says she had already agreed in principle. The written record is very clear. For a second, my father looked as though he wanted to crumple the papers in his hands. Instead, he remained silent. My mother stepped forward with one final attempt to justify everything. We were trying to avoid a legal dispute. Caleb looked at her. By presenting a document that represented her consent without confirmation. The question hung in the room unanswered. No one volunteered a response. Caleb continued in the same measured tone. The trust provides an opportunity to correct the situation, but only if all interference ends immediately. That means any demands regarding the property must be withdrawn. No ownership claims may be asserted. No actions may be taken that suggest possession rights belong to anyone other than the legal owner. Everything stops. Something he said caught my attention. I looked up. What do you mean by actions? Caleb turned toward me. Your father previously asked whether another resident could establish service history at the property before the end of the year. For a second, I did not understand. Then it clicked. Utility accounts. He had already explored ways to create records suggesting Luke lived there. Caleb continued. The request was denied because no ownership documentation supported it. A quiet laugh escaped me. Of course. They had been working on this longer than I realized. Across the table, Luke was no longer looking at me. He was staring directly at our father. The frustration on his face was impossible to miss. For the first time that evening, the person he seemed angry with was not me. It was the man who had convinced him that taking my house would be easy. You told me this would be simple. Luke's frustration was no longer directed at me. It was aimed squarely at our father. Dad immediately fired back. It would have been if she had cooperated. Priya actually laughed under her breath at that. Caleb did not. There was never a version of this situation that was simple, he said. Luke barely seemed to hear him. He was already scanning the suspension notice, searching for the one detail that mattered most. How much money is being held up? That is not the issue, Dad replied. Luke looked up instantly. How much? Caleb answered without hesitation. Approximately $80,000 per beneficiary, plus any remaining distributions subject to final accounting. The room went quiet. I watched the number settle into Luke's mind. The house was worth much more than that, and I could almost see him comparing the figures. That realization made me uneasy. Not because of the trust, because I knew my brother. If he still believed he could somehow gain control of the property, losing money would not necessarily discourage him. It might simply make him more determined. A second later, he shoved his chair back. Forget the trust. Mom immediately turned toward him. "Luke, stop!" But he was already committed. Grandpa was influenced. Everyone knows it. I am not backing down because Mara found another attorney willing to throw paperwork around. Caleb remained completely calm. If you enter that property while claiming ownership or residency without legal authority, you will be creating a serious problem for yourself. Luke responded with a thin smile. It was the kind of smile I remembered from years ago whenever he convinced himself the rules would not apply to him. We will see what law enforcement thinks about that. Then he walked out. Dad muttered something under his breath and followed. A few moments later, my mother gathered what composure she had left and headed for the door as well. The front door slammed hard enough to shake the cabinet in the dining room. Silence settled over the house. Priya finally exhaled. This is not over. No, Caleb agreed. Not even close. He turned toward me. You should make sure your security cameras are recording. Keep copies of your ownership documents available. And do not meet with Luke alone. Something in his tone made me pay closer attention. Why? Because if he is determined enough, he may try to create the appearance of residency before business resumes next week. The warning stayed with me long after everyone left. That night, I slept very little. The next morning, shortly after 7, my phone vibrated with a security alert from the front porch camera. I opened the video feed. My stomach tightened immediately. Luke was standing on the front steps. Beside him stood a locksmith carrying equipment. 2 large duffel bags rested near the front door. Parked at the curb was a county patrol vehicle. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. Luke looked remarkably comfortable standing there, almost as if he believed the house already belonged to him. The patrol officer stood nearby with a careful expression, clearly aware that family disputes often became complicated. I watched for another second before heading to the front door. When I opened it, Luke smiled. Good morning. The deputy stepped forward first. Ma'am, I am Deputy Harlan. I am here only to keep the situation peaceful. No one is being removed from the property today. I am simply present while the parties discuss a dispute. I nodded. Then I looked at Luke. What exactly are you doing here? He lifted one of the duffel bags slightly. Collecting my things. I stared at him. Your things. You have never lived here. For a brief moment, I remembered my mother's words from the night before. Your brother needs this house. Not a guest room, not temporary help. The entire house. The deputy glanced between us. Do you own the residence? Yes, I had anticipated this possibility. The deed was already printed and waiting on the kitchen counter. So were the tax records and insurance documents. Everything was in my name. I handed the paperwork to Deputy Harlan. He reviewed the documents carefully, then looked back at Luke. Do you have a court order? Luke gave a short laugh. This is family property. I have permission. He reached into a folder and removed a folded document. The moment I saw it, I knew what was coming. Another piece of paper. Another attempt to manufacture authority where none existed. Luke unfolded the document and held it out. According to the heading, it was an occupancy agreement. The formatting looked official from a distance, but even before reading a single line, I had a strong suspicion it was about to raise more questions than it answered. The document claimed that I had agreed to let Luke occupy a bedroom in the lower level of the house during a temporary family arrangement. My name appeared at the bottom. So did a signature. It was not mine. Again. Deputy Harlan studied the page for several moments. When was this supposedly signed? Last month, Luke answered immediately. That is incorrect, I said. The locksmith looked from the document to my face, then to the deputy. Whatever conclusion he reached, it happened quickly. Without a word, he stepped backward off the porch. Luke noticed at once. Where are you going?" The locksmith shrugged. "I am not changing locks during a property dispute when the documented owner is standing right here, and there is no court order." Then he turned and headed toward his vehicle. Luke muttered something under his breath. I kept my attention on the deputy. "A nearly identical version of this document was sent to the trust office 2 days ago," I said. "Their legal counsel is already aware of it." Almost on cue, a familiar vehicle turned onto the street. Caleb's car pulled in behind the patrol unit. He stepped out carrying the same leather folder and walked directly toward us. His first greeting was to the deputy. "Caleb Mercer, counsel for the Trust Administration." Deputy Harlan nodded. "You the attorney involved in this matter?" "Something like that," Caleb replied. Then he accepted the document from Luke and reviewed it carefully. A moment later, he compared it to a copy from his folder. The language matched. The formatting matched. Even the questionable signature resembled the version already submitted to the trust office. He handed both pages to the deputy. "These documents contain the same claims," he said. "There is no court order, no transfer of ownership, and no legal basis establishing residency." Luke immediately grew louder. "This is ridiculous. Grandpa wanted the house to stay in the family." Caleb answered without hesitation. "The property is in the family. It belongs to Mara." The deputy returned the paper. "I am not authorizing any entry based on this." Luke's expression hardened.
"So she just keeps everything?"
"Yes," I said. "That is generally how ownership works." His eyes locked onto mine. For a moment, I recognized the same expression I had seen countless times growing up. The look that appeared whenever he thought he could push someone into giving way. His voice became quieter. That was never a good sign. "You can cooperate, Mara, or this situation can become very unpleasant." Before I could respond, Caleb shifted slightly forward. Not enough to be dramatic, just enough to make his presence clear. "Statements like that tend to become part of the record," he said. Luke laughed. "What record? We are standing on a porch." Caleb's expression never changed. "Every dispute starts somewhere." That answer seemed to unsettle him more than any argument. I could see him recalculating. Not apologizing, not regretting anything, simply calculating. Then my phone vibrated. A motion alert from one of the exterior cameras. Without thinking, I looked down. At first, the image made no sense. Then everything clicked at once. The camera overlooking the side yard showed my father. He was near the cellar entrance behind the house. In one hand, he carried a large plastic storage container. In the other was a key. My pulse jumped. The scene suddenly explained everything. Luke had arrived at the front with paperwork, a locksmith, and a deputy. Meanwhile, Dad had gone around the back. "Deputy," I said immediately. "My father is on the property." Everyone turned toward me. I held out the phone. On the screen, Dad placed the storage container beside the cellar entrance and glanced around the yard. Then he bent toward the lock. Inside the container, visible for only a brief moment before the camera angle shifted, were personal items. Clothing, toiletries, several pieces of unopened mail addressed to Luke. The realization hit me instantly. They were not trying to move him in. They were trying to create evidence that he had already been living there. The difference mattered. And they knew it. The moment Deputy Harlan handed the phone back, I was already heading toward the side yard. The cellar entrance still had the same exterior lock my grandfather had used for years. After the property transferred to me, I had replaced the locks on the main entrances, but I never bothered with the cellar. It contained little more than old tools, paint supplies, and emergency equipment. Apparently that had been a mistake. My father stood beside the door with a key in his hand and one foot planted firmly against the stone step. The large plastic container sat beside him. From a distance, it looked almost ordinary. Up close, it told a very different story. Deputy Harlan's voice carried across the yard. "Sir, step away from the door." Dad immediately straightened. "I am simply collecting family belongings." "No," I said. "You are trying to create them." He looked at me with familiar disbelief. It was the same expression he always wore when caught doing something he should not have been doing.
Somehow, he always seemed more offended by being confronted than by his own actions. A few seconds later, Luke rounded the corner. The moment he saw the container, he stopped. "Dad." His voice was low. At least he understood what everyone else was seeing. The clear plastic bin contained exactly what someone would need to manufacture the appearance of residency. Several sets of folded men's clothing, a toiletry kit, new towels that still carried store tags, and a stack of unopened mail addressed to Luke at my address. Not old correspondence, not personal records accumulated over time. Freshly delivered items. Advertisements, bank envelopes, promotional offers, government correspondence. Everything looked recent. Everything looked carefully selected. And every piece remained unopened. The conclusion was impossible to miss. My father had not come to retrieve property. He had come to leave it behind. Deputy Harlan moved closer to the container. "Who owns the residence?" "I do," I answered. Do you authorize him to enter the cellar or store these items on the property?
"No." The deputy nodded and turned toward my father. "Then I need you to step away from the door immediately." Dad lifted his hands. "This situation is being exaggerated. My son has belongings here." Caleb responded before I could. "Items that appeared after a locksmith was hired, after disputed occupancy documents surfaced, and after a civil standby was requested." Then he gestured toward the container. "And if he genuinely lived here, those envelopes would not still be sealed." That observation changed everything. The evidence suddenly looked even worse. Even Luke seemed uncomfortable. The setup had become too obvious, too rushed, too transparent. Deputy Harlan pulled out a notebook. "I need identification and information from everyone involved." My father frowned. "For what purpose?" "For documentation," the deputy replied.
And because there has been an attempt to establish access to a property through disputed paperwork, while ownership records indicate otherwise. Luke immediately tried to separate himself from the situation. I did not know anything about what was happening back here. That may have been true. It did not solve his problem. Caleb held up the occupancy document. "You arrived with this paperwork. You arrived with luggage. You arrived with a locksmith. Whether you knew every detail or not, you were not simply passing by." Dad's voice rose again. "This is still a family matter." The deputy looked at him for a long moment. Then he answered with calm certainty. "No, sir. This is a property dispute that people are attempting to describe as a family matter." For the first time since Thanksgiving dinner, nobody had a response ready. The silence that followed was the most honest thing anyone in my family had produced all week. A few moments later, my mother appeared through the side gate. I had not even realized she had followed the others back to the house. She stopped immediately when she saw the scene in the yard. The deputy, the storage container, the stack of mail. My father standing several feet away from the cellar entrance with a copied key still in his hand. "What is going on here?" she asked. By then, the answer barely mattered. The important part was no longer the argument. It was the evidence. Deputy Harlan carefully documented everything. He photographed the container and its contents. He photographed the mail addressed to Luke. He photographed the key. He photographed the disputed occupancy paperwork. He reviewed the security images showing my father approaching the cellar entrance from the rear of the property. He collected copies of ownership records from Caleb and confirmed that the locksmith had declined to perform any work. Every detail was recorded.
Every detail became part of the same timeline. Then he said the one thing I needed everyone to hear.
If anyone returns to this property claiming a right to occupy it without proper legal authority, they may be subject to trespass enforcement. The words settled over the yard. My mother looked ready to respond, but Caleb spoke first. And if interference with ownership rights continues, I will recommend immediate enforcement of the trust provisions. That statement affected my father more than anything else. Not because he suddenly felt remorse, because he finally understood the position he had placed himself in. The disputed documents, the attempted occupancy claim, the misleading correspondence, the security footage, the staged personal belongings, the locksmith, the deputy report. Together they formed a complete record. What he had intended as pressure had become evidence. Luke kicked the bottom step in frustration and immediately regretted it. After muttering under his breath, he turned and headed back toward the driveway. My mother followed. Before leaving, she paused long enough to look at me. The familiar smile returned, the one she used whenever she wanted to pretend she still controlled the outcome. "You will regret letting this become so ugly." I glanced toward the container, the unopened mail, the copied key, the deputy writing notes in the middle of my backyard. Then I looked back at her. No. What I regret is not installing those cameras sooner. That ended the confrontation. There were no dramatic scenes, no shouting matches, no final speeches, just a failed plan collapsing under documentation and daylight. By the beginning of the following week, Caleb had assembled everything into a complete file. The deputy report, the disputed occupancy paperwork, the communications submitted to the trust office, the security footage, the photographs from the property. Every piece fit together. A few days later, Caleb called. "The trustee has reached a final decision," he said. I sat at my kitchen table. The same table where Thanksgiving dinner had turned into a legal dispute. I already knew what was coming. "The trust provisions have been fully enforced," Caleb continued. "All remaining distributions have been forfeited." I sat quietly for a moment. "All of them?" "Yes," he replied. "All remaining distributions. Permanently. Under my grandfather's estate plan, those funds were never redirected back to the people who caused the violation. Instead, they passed to the alternate beneficiaries he had selected years earlier, organizations he had supported quietly throughout his life. The outcome felt unmistakably like something Grandpa would have planned. He had not simply protected the house. He had ensured that if anyone ignored his wishes and tried to challenge them anyway, the money would benefit causes he cared about rather than reward the conflict. That evening, Luke called twice. I let both calls go unanswered. My father sent a single email. It contained one sentence. "You chose paperwork over family." I replied only once. "No. Grandpa made that decision years ago. I simply respected it." After that, the matter was effectively over. No more visits, no more demands, no more attempts to establish residency, no more notices. The house remained exactly where it had always been, in my name, protected by the same planning my grandfather had completed long before any of this began. In the months that followed, the legal noise faded. The trust decision became final. No attorney wanted to pursue theories that had already been undermined by documents, reports, and recorded evidence. Luke lost the financial safety net he had counted on. My father lost both the money and the confidence that he could force a different outcome through pressure and persistence. My mother continued telling people that the situation had been misunderstood. But there are limits to how much a story can be rewritten once the facts exist in writing. As for me, I replaced the cellar lock the very same week. Then I upgraded the security system. For the first time in years, I stopped waiting for another surprise. I simply enjoyed the home my grandfather had entrusted to me. Looking back, I understand something now that I did not fully appreciate then. Grandpa left me more than a house. He left a framework.
A structure built not only to preserve property, but to withstand entitlement, pressure, and manipulation. And in the end, that protection proved every bit as valuable as the house itself. If this story made you think, consider what you would have done in the same situation. Which moment changed everything for you? The notice at Thanksgiving dinner? The trust provision hidden in the estate documents? Or the container of staged belongings beside the cellar door? Thank you for spending time with this story, and I hope you will join me again for the next one.